Vice-Chancellor, faculty of the university and colleges, students, the Oxford community, friends, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for welcoming me here, and it's a great honor to deliver this year's lecture. I will do my utmost to live up to this fine tradition and to my illustrious predecessors. When I asked the organizing team if I was the first journalist to give this lecture, I was told there were others who had worked as journalists before going on to do other things by the time they stood here. And the example given was not exactly heartening because it was Winston Churchill. Now, I have no plans to use journalism as a springboard to anything else, but I am in a new phase of my professional life, and I will speak here about our past and our present, and do so from my heart. I also thank you, Vice-Chancellor, for trusting me with this lecture, even though my own undergraduate degree comes from a younger upstart of a place. Or as they like to think of it, a more modern place, up where the chill east wind blows and they cling to a few extra Nobel Prizes for comfort. Oh, there are a few of us here, are there? The last time I was on a stage in any way comparable to this was in the final days of the election campaign last year for the prime ministerial TV debate. And that afternoon, as we were rehearsing and preparing for Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer to arrive, the police came to see me in my dressing room. They said they wanted to talk through what would happen if there was a disruption that took us off air. We would clear the stage, they explained, and we wanted to introduce you to the officer who would be clearing you off the stage so that you're not alarmed when he carries you off. Reassuring. But here today, I will be going back to our imperial past, although I do want to begin in the near past. And that's because when I look at today's undergraduates, I am conscious that at the same point in my life, 30 years ago, I was emerging from my university education into a less troubled world. The Berlin Wall had been torn down, the Soviet Union had come to an end. It felt as though societies were moving towards more freedom and more prosperity. The 9/11 attacks had not happened. Today, the level of conflict and the economic pressures on countries and on individuals make for a very different reality. The news is often hard to take, leading to a sense of overload, even at times despair. The search for reason is part of this lecture's title because my own search for reason, a compass through these times, is how I try to make sense of dramatic events around us. It is at the heart of my new on-air work through a new set of conversations. And I hope that what I share about that compass may be of use to some of you in providing points of light. But I will first take you back, right back to the age of empire and the environment that existed in another October of 1892 as William Ewart Gladstone rose to his feet here in the Sheldonian to deliver the first of these lectures. I read his as I began work on mine. He was unencumbered by any requirement to communicate in ways that cut through, usually by keeping the message simple. His text was dense, his language lofty, his choice of topic the development of university education in Europe with a particular emphasis on Oxford, he had been here, and a nod to the other place. There is a moment in it, though, that made me pause as he muses on a 19th century version of our own debates on how technology is changing us. Gladstone says there are two dangers before the nation's ancient and still paramount universities. One, that in research they should relax and consequently dwindle. The other, that they should lean to that theory of education which would construct machines of so many horsepower rather than form character. He was thinking of rapid industrialization, but we are grappling with what artificial intelligence means for our lives and our livelihoods. At that moment, Gladstone had recently returned to Downing Street for the fourth time as Prime Minister. He was 82. He would spend much of that final period in office trying to get an Irish Home Rule bill through Parliament. But the general election of 1892 has a particular resonance for me because it brought to the House of Commons for the first time an Asian MP. His name was Dadabhai Naoroji. He was born in India in 1825. He was of the Zoroastrian faith, and I learned about him when I was researching my family memoir, Broken Threads. This is how The Guardian marked the election of an Indian gentleman as a member of Parliament. It was, the paper said, quite different to men coming home with wealth acquired in India and buying themselves a seat. This MP was a native Indian, and the paper said it meant a constituency had disregarded wide differences of creed and race. I must add here that the voters of Central Finsbury had been pretty divided at that election of 1892. Naoroji won by 3 votes, 5 after a recount. And that meant he was often referred to as Dadabhai Narrow Majority. Before 1892, there had been at least one Anglo-Indian MP, but Naoroji was the first to identify as Indian and to question the imperial project with facts and first-hand knowledge. His generation had been eyewitnesses to the 19th century advancement of British power through the East India Company. It used alliance and military force, and sometimes deceit. There were treaties that allowed territory to be taken over if the British deemed a ruler to be incompetent or unsuitable, or when their choice of heir was considered as such. Even then, some of those ousted in this way showed a touching, if bizarre, faith in Queen Victoria herself coming to their aid. When my grandfather's home state of Awadh was taken over in 1856, the deposed ruler's mother travelled all the way to England in the hope that royal to royal, mother to mother, Victoria would restore her family to their position. She was kept waiting for months, and when she was finally granted an audience, she handed Victoria an ornament of pearl and gold and left with nothing, dying in Paris on her way home. Now, British expansionism in India was the backdrop to Naoroji's life. He and his contemporaries saw the thirst for wealth and the determination to hold on to power. When an uprising took place in 1857, it was put down with immense force, including suspected rebels being tied to the mouths of cannons before they were fired. After all, there was more than India at stake. What if the Maori got ideas, or the Irish? In what we might call spin, the rebellion would be recorded for the history books under the more limited term mutiny. And by 1877, Gladstone's great rival Disraeli was making Victoria Empress of India. How then did Naoroji advance in such a climate? He was born into poverty in Bombay, but he gained an education thanks to his widowed mother accessing a scholarship for him. In 1855, he had the chance to travel to England, where he saw technology and prosperity, and he realized with a shock how little of that was flowing towards the colonized. In London, he became active in public life, supporting others' campaigns, votes for women, Ireland, and he became known for his economic critique of colonialism. Once in Parliament, he was able to put his argument forward from within the seat of power. Some of those he influenced are names you will know. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, later independent India's founding father. He was in London studying law in the 1880s, and he knew Naoroji. So too did Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Pakistan's founding father. Indeed, when Naoroji gave his maiden speech in the Commons, 17-year-old Jinnah, only recently arrived in London, was watching from the visitors' gallery. He said later of Gladstone's party, "I grasped that liberalism which became part of my life and thrilled me very much." And there's a link to my own family. One of Naoroji's contemporaries and friends was a man called Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, who I wrote about in Broken Threads. He too had the chance to travel to England in the 1860s, and he too had a shock. Opportunity in education was so much broader than what was available in India. He concluded that the British had done away with the pre-colonial order without offering much beyond missionary schooling to replace it. His response, once home, was to organize, raise funds, and found a college at Aligarh near Delhi, which exists to this day. It was here that my grandmother Tahira was born in 1920, the daughter of the university doctor, and she credited the liberal environment of a university town as a lifelong influence. As the 20th century began, there were clear signs that the age of empire was fading. The Balkan Wars ousted the Ottomans from most of their European territory. The Easter Rising shook British rule in Ireland. The First World War ended the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Tsarist Russia was swept away. Turkey became a republic. The British Empire would endure for longer, and in some ways it was digging in. In 1931, a grand imperial capital, New Delhi, was inaugurated, and passports of the time described those born in British India as British subjects by birth. When I saw this in the pages of my grandfather Shahid's 1932 passport, even though at that point he'd never been to this country, it made me think, does my connection to the UK begin with my father coming here as a doctor in the 1960s? Or is it 3 to 4 generations further back to ancestors living under British rule? It's a question of the lens you choose to look through, or the words that you employ. Words are, of course, the tools of my trade, and I've had to think a lot during my years in journalism about terminology. Today, with reference to Northern Ireland, for example, news reporting will use nationalist and unionist rather than Catholic and Protestant. We've moved on from the days when the primary focus was religious identity. Instead, we signify a political dimension. And yet, in reporting on Muslims, you might well hear about Sunnis and Shias, or the reductive term, the Muslim vote, without any further insight or reference to economic disparities or other factors. You might read of Muslims being engaged in holy war, with no explanation of what the faith says on the use of force. There's little consistency in terminology. Holy war is rarely used for Russia, despite the Orthodox Church casting the conflict in Ukraine in those terms. In Israel, the Prime Minister has used religious language early in the Gaza war. In 1995, Bosnian Serbs executed up to 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys from the ages of 12 to 77. But even though religion was a key dividing line in that conflict, the faith of the perpetrators in Srebrenica, Christianity, is rarely mentioned. Targeting people because of their faith has been seen in the most shattering way here within the last fortnight, with the deadly Yom Kippur attack on the Manchester synagogue. Anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim incidents, religious hate crime overall has been rising. A recent example was 2 men trying to force their way into a mosque in East Sussex before pouring fuel at the entrance and setting it alight. In the US state of Michigan last month, a man drove his vehicle into a church during a Sunday service, opened fire, and set the building on fire, killing 4 people. The FBI has been trying to establish a motive for suspect Thomas Sanford's actions, but we do not need one to condemn all such attackers. Let me return for a moment to history and August 1947, when Pakistan was established as a homeland for a minority religious community, the Muslims of India. When founding father Muhammad Ali Jinnah addressed parliamentarians in Karachi, he said that whether a citizen worshipped in a temple or a mosque or any other place had nothing to do with the business of the state. And he made a reference that has largely been forgotten. Think back to England, he said, and the days when Protestants and Catholics persecuted each other. Those days had gone. And he wanted the same in Pakistan. He wanted what he called the angularities of different communities to vanish. You will find in the course of time, he said, Hindus will cease to be Hindus and Muslims would cease to be Muslims. Not in the religious sense, because that is the personal faith of each individual, but in the political sense as citizens of the state. My 3 Muslim grandparents regarded Jinnah as a role model for his excellence in his profession, his ability to be an equal to the British intellectually, and his social progressiveness. He enabled the education of his sisters as well as his brothers, with one, his lifetime companion Fatima, qualifying as a dentist back in the early 20th century. I happen to know for a fact what he liked to drink, because in 1948, when he visited the officers' mess in Peshawar in northern Pakistan, one of my grandfathers was tasked with asking him just that. The answer was a dry sherry. Now, earlier in my career, it would have been hard to imagine ever speaking in public on themes relating to my own religion or ethnicity. It would have felt too personal, and I just wanted to be like everyone else. But I do think about the responsibility that comes with citizenship, and perhaps particularly with profile, as well as the privilege of speaking from this stage. It is out of the reach of most British Muslims who are underrepresented in occupations like mine and in employment more widely. In contrast, my professional life has taken me from the flags and the missing persons posters of New York after 9/11 to the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh and World War II battlefields in Egypt and Libya, where the Allied and German dead lie a short distance away from each other. I've talked to the Tunisian mother whose son's self-immolation triggered the Arab uprisings, and I've traveled the route of Gandhi's Salt March in India. I've reported from Gaza and Israel, had passes to big summits, and been welcomed into the humblest of homes. I watched the late Queen's cortege approaching Westminster Abbey for her funeral and hoped my words would not fail me as I endeavored to find the right ones for the moment in live commentary. I am so grateful that it was to this country that my father came in 1967, just out of medical school in Lahore and wondering where he might develop his skills. And further back, my grandparents, those British subjects by birth, who never lived here, loved this country's preservation of history, its cherishing of tradition, the rule of law, the fair play. For my part, I've appreciated an atmosphere between media and politicians that's meant at the end of a combative interview, it was perfectly normal to stand up, shake hands, say our thank yous, and see you next time. When I told Boris Johnson in a live interview to please stop talking, he gave me a hard time on air, but later, privately, apologized. All of this makes our country precious. None of it should be taken for granted. Nurturing it doesn't mean shying away from hard conversations, but seeing people of all backgrounds with the same common decency, understanding that courage, evil, excellence, moral weakness, stupidity, the whole spectrum of character and responses to circumstances, these exist in human beings everywhere. All of this might seem obvious, but nearly 6 years ago, the chair of the press regulator Ipsos said, after 5 years in the role, that he thought Muslims were on occasion written about in the newspapers in ways Jews or Catholics would not be. And I'll share an example here of someone for whom I think it is worth asking the question, would she have been perceived exactly the same way if she'd had a different name, had not been Muslim? This story goes back to 2015 and 3 school friends leaving their homes in London, traveling through Turkey to join Islamic State, a proscribed terror group in Syria. It was soon after the murders of hostages, including journalists James Foley and Stephen Sotloff, aid workers Peter Kassig and David Haynes, and Alan Henning, a Salford taxi driver who was on his 4th trip delivering supplies to Syria when he was abducted by IS. Shamima Begum, one of the 3, was 15 at the time. 4 years later, The Times found her and interviewed her in a camp in Syria. She was 9 months pregnant, about to give birth to a 3rd child, her older 2 having died as babies through illness and malnutrition. The callousness of her words in that interview, including her saying she'd been unmoved by the sight of a captured fighter's severed head in a bin, prompted widespread revulsion. Amid the scramble to get the first TV interview, both Sky and the BBC reached her. One broadcaster said their correspondent had tracked down the IS bride in a hospital just hours after she gave birth. The other recorded their interview when her son was 3 days old, the distinctive cry of a newborn audible off camera as she spoke. When I watched these interviews, I saw something that appeared to go entirely unnoticed in editorial decision-making or was regarded as unimportant. I saw a teenage mother only just postpartum. I thought of my own experience, giving birth in NHS hospitals to 3 healthy babies, with family members helping out. I know I was in no fit state to give any interview in the weeks, let alone the days after those births, and certainly not an interview of consequence to the rest of my life, conducted without advice, representation, or even access to information. The teenager said it herself in one interview. I don't have my phone. I can't go on the internet. I don't know what's going on around me right now. I found these interviews very hard to reconcile with a sense of duty of care, assessing whether an interviewee is in a position to give informed consent or in a position where they can speak freely. Shamima Begum was still living among IS women. It was rare to see any focus in reporting of how she was under 16, legally a child, when she made the worst decision of her life, which, to be clear, was also criminal, because IS is a designated terror organization. In late 2015, a few months after she and her friends went to Syria, I was given an official briefing on the kind of online material used by IS to entice girls to join them. It was both clever and visually attractive, playing on escaping from the constraints of home, from strict parents, from prejudice and class inequality. It was replete with imagery, patterns, and emojis likely to appeal to a teenage girl. Little of this ever emerged publicly. Questions about grooming or entrapment have rarely gained currency. Little attention has been paid to what was reported later, that the man who took the 3 London girls into Syria was working as a source for Canadian intelligence. At the time, he was smuggling minors. Shamima Begum's 3rd baby, the newborn who can be heard whimpering on tape, died within a few weeks of his birth. She herself remains in a camp in Syria, her British citizenship taken away, and with little prospect of getting another passport. I accept that I may be more alive to aspects of this story because of what I share with Shamima in terms of our identity. But pointing out what others may not see has long been a source of societal attitudes shifting or of rules and laws changing. When the first Romanis lecture was given here in 1892, there would have been very few women in the room. The university did not award degrees to women until 1920, although you were ahead of Cambridge. And this lecture was not given by a woman until 1963. That was Lady Violet Bonham Carter, whose chosen topic, the impact of personality on politics, feels evergreen. As the Second World War ended, 2 jurists developed the concepts of crimes against humanity and genocide as legal concepts. Hirsch Lauterpacht and Raphael Lemkin were both Jewish, with family who'd been murdered in the Holocaust. Their professional response, their shaping of international law, their drive for the protection of human beings was informed by what they knew from bitter experience. There had been no protection for their loved ones. At that moment in 1945, there was a new understanding, a determination even, that civilians should be better safeguarded in future. 50 years on, exactly when I was leaving university, it was the age of peacekeeping forces and humanitarian intervention. We are now 80 years on, but our time is one of acute mass harm to civilians in Gaza, in Sudan, in Ukraine, and elsewhere. 104-year-old World War II veteran Yaver Abbas reflected on this when he spoke to the BBC this summer for VJ Day. During the war, he had felt he was doing something worthwhile for humanity, he said, but now we seem to have learnt nothing. The killing of innocent men, women, children, and even babies goes on. For journalists, this is the deadliest period since the Committee to Protect Journalists began collecting records in the 1990s. Of the nearly 60 deaths it has recorded so far this year, more than 40 were Palestinians, and it has accused Israel of engaging in the deadliest and most deliberate effort to kill and silence journalists that it has ever documented. These deaths go almost unremarked by our media, even though editors have used the work of Palestinian journalists to tell the story of a conflict from which we have been barred independent access. I promised at the start of this that I would share my search for reason, some kind of a compass for our times. I may have overpromised, given our turbulent world. But I have found points of light where I have gone away from and beyond headlines into history and forgotten context. In that tapestry are the common threads that enrich my understanding of the world and give me hope. Because of my heritage, I will share 5 thoughts on this theme with you, all of them relating in some way to Islam and Muslims, and challenging what we often see as East and West. My purpose is not to gloss over cultural divides or issues, or to pretend that there aren't customs or practices that may be out of step with our times and our place here in this country. But I share these in line with the spirit of learning that has guided this university for centuries. First, Muslims have a long tradition of inquiry. In the Quran, Islam's holy book, there are more than 80 different places where the text makes clear the importance of reason and insight. It says again and again, use your reason, that it is carrying messages for people who think, that people should not swerve from the path of reason. Such phrases are an invitation or an imperative to reflect, to use our intellect. The pursuit of knowledge is laid out as a duty for every Muslim man and woman, something forgotten by the supposedly pious Taliban, who continue to restrict every possible aspect of their countrywomen's lives. I wonder how many of you can name the world's oldest university that is still operating today. In fact, I'd love you to raise your hands if you think you know where in the world that oldest university that is still operating today is. Okay, raise them a bit higher so I can see them. Okay, so some of you, okay, so keep your hand up if you have the correct answer, because the answer is the Al-Qarawiyyin University in Fez, Morocco. Some of you did know. It is recognized as the world's oldest continuously operating institution of higher education, much older than Oxford, and it was established by a woman, Fatima al-Fihri, in the 9th century, using money that she inherited from her father. I counted the 80+ mentions of reason, insight, and thought in the Quran with the help of my mother. And from a translation by Muhammad Asad, who was born Leopold Weiss in Lviv, present-day Ukraine, in 1900, the grandson of a rabbi. He quoted the words, "for people who think," on the title page of his translation, and his central principle was to be guided by the linguistic usage prevalent at the time. Hence, he says, the word Muslim would have been understood in 7th century Arabia as one who surrenders wholeheartedly to God, unlimited to any specific community or denomination. Similarly, he says, the word kafir, meaning one who knowingly and willingly covers up the innate truth of their being, has become unwarrantably simplified into unbeliever or infidel. There is much more in Asad's commentary. He was a remarkable and unusual man who had once been a journalist and who was later a diplomat, who was interned by the British in India during the Second World War because he was Austrian, and who lost family in Auschwitz in the same period. My second point is about the Renaissance. In the 300 years before study at Oxford began, cities in Spain, in and around Andalusia, present-day Andalusia, became European centers of learning under Muslim rulers. Science, mathematics, and the arts were patronized. This southern European environment was fed by what was happening in the Middle East, particularly Baghdad, from the early 9th century. It's been called the world's most striking period of scholarship since ancient Greece. At the heart of it were people like the mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, from whose name algorithm is derived, and thanks to whom we also have the word algebra or al-jabr, derived from the title of one of his books. There was a movement to translate Greek texts, including Aristotle and the physician and polymath Galen, into Arabic, to absorb and understand learning from Persia and India. Without this thirst for knowledge, this openness to other cultures, many of the Greek texts would likely have been lost. Instead, they were treasured and kept alive. Commentaries were produced, and these led to further advancement and discoveries, which influenced medieval thought and flowed into Northern Europe. Later, the translation of texts from Arabic into Latin and other languages, often by Muslim and Jewish translators in Spain, provided material for the great rebirth of Europe from the 14th century. Such acts over centuries bring to life the Quran's emphasis on reason and insight, because they show generations of scholars were being the people who think that their faith demanded. And so to my third point, which is about architecture. Here too, we can see a continuum. Just as Byzantine and Middle Eastern Christian heritage became part of Islamic architecture, what Muslims built in Egypt, in Jerusalem, near Jericho in the West Bank, as well as Damascus, Sicily, Spain, and elsewhere, has influenced buildings we treasure, from the Doge's Palace to Notre Dame and Westminster Abbey. We can see this in the pointed arch, in the trefoil, in cloisters, stained glass, the rose window, ribbed vaulting. These features and others can be traced to early examples in 4th and 5th century churches and monasteries in Syria, and then in palaces and mosques. Styles and structures enabled not only by an appreciation of beauty, but a knowledge of advanced mathematics, which the Arabs had. However, connections between English Gothic architecture and Muslims or Islamic buildings is little recognized today, although Sir Christopher Wren did say what he called the Saracen method, Saracen being the common term for Muslim or Arab, was used to determine how to support the immense dome at St. Paul's. Towards the end of his life, Wren wrote that Gothic architecture should be, with more reason, called the Saracen style. We borrowed again from them out of their Arabic books what they, with great diligence, had translated from the Greeks. And at this point, I'm going to ask all of you here in the Sheldonian to please look up. Think about what lies beyond the painted ceiling. Some of you will know that this building was an early commission for Christopher Wren, built between 1664 and 1669 as a venue for Oxford's ceremonial occasions. Wren modelled his design on a 1st century Roman theatre, but while that was open to the skies, he needed a roof. This is England. And he needed a large one, given the scale of this design. He did not want pillars. He found his answer in geometry, working with a fellow mathematician to devise a weave of timbers that lies beyond that ceiling so that the roof would be self-supporting. We can't see the structural elements from here, but what Wren did was a precursor to how he would approach St. Paul's. And his Oxford, 17th century Oxford, he was a young professor of astronomy when he designed the Sheldonian. Well, that Oxford was very keen on learning from the Arabs. A chancellor of the university, another William Laud, had asked every English ship sailing to the Eastern Mediterranean to return with at least one Arabic manuscript, and founded Oxford's first chair in Arabic. The term chair also has a link to the Muslim world, where teachers would be seated in a kursi, a chair or a throne, while their pupils sat on the floor. So the teacher's elevated position symbolizes the elevation of knowledge. Laud's first appointee to the Oxford Chair or Professorship, which is still in existence today, and I think Professor Qutbuddin is here with us, That first chair was Edward Pocock, chaplain, scholar, and translator who returned from Aleppo to take up the role. Some of the texts he brought with him remain in the Bodleian. And for more on this point, architecture and craftsmanship, I recommend the books of Diana Dark, who is an alumna of this university. My fourth point is poetry. The 13th century poet Rumi is so popular in the United States that he's sometimes called America's best-selling poet. But Jalaluddin Rumi was born in present-day Afghanistan, wrote mostly in Persian, and died in what is now Turkey. Millions of people respond to the beauty of his verse. In Europe and the US, he tends to be described as a Sufi mystic, with no mention of how deeply embedded in Islamic theology and scripture he was. And in the most popular English translations, Rumi's references to God have been stripped out. It is a missed opportunity for thought. For example, there is a famous line of Rumi best known in English as this: "Out between ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there." The more accurate translation would be, "Out beyond ideas of disbelief and faith, there is a field. I'll meet you there." Rumi was a man of deep faith, but here he is acknowledging that there's a spectrum going all the way from no belief to the devout. He is also advocating rising above and beyond whatever form of religiosity you inherit, and again, thinking, discussing, developing. The bigger picture is, imagine all those readers in the US and elsewhere knowing that faith and art exist together for Muslims too. Instead, removing this context erases a vital dimension of Rumi's art. It's like looking at a painting of the Madonna and Child and thinking it's a mother and baby, having no idea that it represents Mary and Jesus, that it is deeply embedded in Christian piety. I was 8 years old when I was taken to Florence by my parents, and I saw in an alcove above where we were standing a Michelangelo Pieta. My parents explained that the collapsed figure at the center was Jesus, taken down from the cross, and the women around him were his mother and Mary Magdalene. The story, as well as the sight of the sculpture, is why it made such an impression on me and why I have never forgotten it. Because you can never have too much Rumi, here's another example. Usually rendered as, "Let the beauty we love be what we do. There are hundreds of ways to kneel and kiss the earth." The kneeling and kissing the earth are in the original ruku, bowing down, and sujud, meaning prostration in prayer. Rumi is referring to worship as he and his community would have engaged in it multiple times a day. But the religious symbolism has been neutered. The Duke University scholar, Professor Omid Safi, says, it's as if in order for Rumi to be universally relevant, he has to be de-Islamized and removed from his context. Fortunately, Professor Safi has done his own translations in a book called Radical Love, and that's the version I'm going to recommend to all of you here. There you will see Rumi alongside the Arabic and Persian traditions that nurtured his mind, faith, and his art. My final point is the world wars. Most of you will probably know that Muslims fought and died for the Allies in both conflicts. My late father founded the World Wars Muslim Memorial Trust, which hopes to build a memorial to the Muslim fallen, as there are to other groups and communities, at the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire. But I only recently discovered a new estimate for the World War I numbers through research initiated by a Belgian, Luc Ferrier, who read his great-grandfather's wartime diaries and found repeated references to Mohammedans in the trenches. Using evidence from 19 countries, from former French colonies to the span of the British Empire, he found that 2.5 million Muslims contributed to the Allied cause as soldiers or laborers. In the detail of the research is the human story. Chaplains, imams, and rabbis learning each other's prayers and rituals in order to comfort the wounded and to conduct religious burials on the battlefield. The more we know, the more we can feel for each other. The more we learn, the more we see that successive generations and societies have built on each other's advances. We have a common inheritance of knowledge. And I find that a source of comfort. It is part of how I see the world, and it will be at the heart of my new work in global, long-form podcast conversations that will explore people and ideas in depth and with head, heart, and soul. I won't shy away from tougher exchanges. I'm still prepared to tell people to stop talking, although I decided to rise above Elon Musk calling me an NPC or non-player character. I could say shithole on Radio 4, and sorry, Vice Chancellor, I've now said it here, but that won't be possible on Bloomberg because profanity is definitely out. I will keep a spirit of endeavor, seek evidence, appreciate expertise, and root every episode in the belief that the art of conversation is to be treasured and safeguarded, not least in the age of AI. Let me end where I began, in the election year of 1892. Naoroji's parliamentary career was destined to be short. He lost his seat in 1895 after only 3 years, and he died in 1917 back in India. He was never to see the self-rule for which he campaigned, but Gandhi called him the father of the nation, and he became known as the Grand Old Man of India. Here, Gladstone's long service made him the Grand Old Man to his supporters. And in this spot, 133 years ago, he ended with the motto of Oxford, Dominus illuminatio mea, the Lord is my light. He hoped the light would always be there, never darkening or obscuring. It was the light, he said, that yielded the best in leaf and flower and fruit, and he wished it to sustain the life of Oxford in the generations yet to come. And now here we are, the generations which were far in the future when he spoke. I cannot find better words than his to end, but I can make the wish wider still. May we all seek the light of knowledge, and may we find the common threads. Thank you.